morning, everybody.
Good morning. I hope you enjoyed the party last night.
Seems like, no? Okay, so we are at the last day of the conference, and we will moderate the session. So I'm Sonja, I think you know, and that's...
My name is Olga.
And we have two keynotes. They are wonderful, therefore I'm happy that you all are here. And then we will have some closing words, but before that we have some housekeeping to do. So I have you to remind you again that the two fire exits are in the back and the other ones are here, but yeah, I hope we will not need them, no, today.
But you are there already 50 days or
Come on, no? Just to wake up everybody. So we have two keynotes, and we will start directly with Chinwe, and she will tell us something about agroforestry dynamics and potentials for transformation change towards sustainability. I really warmly welcome her. She's a professor at the University of Bern, and her field is geography. And with that, just join us. I think the field is yours, no?
Yeah. I thought the girls would be doing that.
Okay, so good morning, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chinwe Ifejika Speranza, and I'm happy to be here. And I also thank the organizers for inviting me, and thank you also for taking the time to be here with us today. So I'll be talking about agroforestry dynamics and the potentials for transformative change towards sustainability. And what I'll be presenting is not just my work, but also the work of others. The question is, how do we achieve transformative change in agroforestry, especially when we are talking, that is the topic of our conference this week, especially when we are saying that it's below potentials. So now let's start, and we look at the contributions of agroforestry. And what we know is that from databases, of course, you have to take these global databases. There are certain ranges of uncertainties in the data set, but they give us ideas about the global distribution of what we're looking at. And when we look at agroforestry, then this database is telling us that about 43% of the area used for agriculture globally is covered with agroforestry. So that tells us that agroforestry is important. If not, we will not all be here today. It contributes to food security, food production, soil fertility, biodiversity, erosion control, and many other things that you discussed today. So then, this brings us then back to the question of why do we have a performance gap in agroforestry? Many of you, in your presentations, you mentioned that more could be done, or that agroforestry has the potential, but still, that potential has not been achieved. So globally, we have a low adoption, despite its proven benefits. So, for example, if you look in the USA, you only have 1.7% of the farms that are practicing agroforestry. But across the tropics, for example, across Africa, you have like around 30-something%. And then the ecological performance is also well noted. But then if we look at it in terms of social dimensions and human rights dimensions, then we also have issues there that need to be addressed. And of course, with climate change and environmental degradation and the questions about, what can agroforestry contribute, then we see that in terms of carbon sequestration, it also has a lot to contribute. It can contribute up to 5 megagrams of carbon, but then again, the socioeconomic dimensions come in. So we see here that we are dealing with a system, and the limitations that we have can be summarized under ecological functioning, economic viability. It can also be summarized under resilience or social justice. I think, let me see if I can get the, I don't know how to do it. Okay, let me leave it. The pointer here. But anyway, so the message is, or the question is, if we're looking at all these dimensions, we're saying agroforestry is ecologically, there is no problem with agroforestry. Then the question is, okay, but we have social dimensions, we have governance dimensions, we have economic dimensions of the same topic that we are talking about. So then we can think of it in terms of a system, agroforestry as a system. And that means we have social, we have ecological, we have socioeconomic, social justice, and institutional and policy dimensions that we need to talk of. Even when we are talking about maybe breeding a new hybrid variety for cocoa or for shea nuts, then we still have to talk about it. So this diagram, I use this diagram to show these systemic dimensions that we should be thinking about when we are talking about agroforestry, because it's not just about those trees on the farm, it's about the actors that we have in the system. So it's about politics and institutions, it's about economy, it's about technology and infrastructure, it's also about culture and society, and it's about demography. So maybe if I can ask you to show me how to use the pointer, because this one is not so. So if we go ahead and look at these dimensions, there are interactions or there are interconnections with these dimensions. So agroforestry, when we think about it as a system, then it's also about being a food system. So it's not just about commodities. When we talk about commodities, for example, we talk about avocado is a commodity, cocoa is a commodity. What else do we have? We have shea butter. But all these, besides these dimensions of agroforestry commodities, we have agroforestry as providing food. So in that sense, it's about a food system. Here in this picture, we see pictures of farms across Africa, just to show you the diversity of systems that we can have. So you can have the commercial systems, you can have the, thank you very much.
I'm not sure if it works, you have to try.
Oh, okay, yeah, it does.
No.
Okay, yeah, okay. So are you seeing it when I move like this? No? Okay, then I continue with the PowerPoint, it's okay. With the pointer. Thank you, Felix. So here then we see that we have different varieties of agroforestry. So in that sense, agroforestry is a food system because besides providing mangoes or providing pawpaws, which the family can eat, but which they can also sell in the market, we also have agroforestry as commodity. So cocoa, shea butter, avocado, and so on. So this is, for example, here we see a home garden in Uganda with mangoes, and then here we see dispersed intercropping, that is B, with maize, mango and maize, and then intercropping with annual crops in C, that would be this. We see an early cropping, for example, with Grevillea robusta, and then we have early cropping also climbing beans planted with hedges of glycidia. So this is the glycidia, sorry. and that would be the Robusta. So in that sense, so when we look at this, then we see that there are different varieties. So when we talk about agroforestry, it's not just one system, but we are talking about agroforestry as a food system. And when we talk about food systems, then it's, our focus even gets wider. So we are not just looking at that crop, but we are looking at, for example, the environmental drivers, which can be in terms of minerals, where are we importing them from? It can be in terms of climate, water, biodiversity. And many of us, we focus on these single dimensions. And that means that we need to work together to bring the system together. And if we look in terms of socioeconomic drivers, then we have markets, policies, we also have governance issues, social organizations, farmers organizing themselves, and then we have individual factors. In some of the sessions, we were talking about farmers getting old in certain world regions. Across some African countries, we rather have young farmers, but still, when we look at their social demographic, there are also issues related to capacity building, for example. So in that sense, these dimensions, they interact, socioeconomic drivers, environmental drivers, and we can look at it in terms of food system activities, where we look at the food environment, enabling environment in terms of policies. For example, it can be also consumer characteristics. For example, do consumers in Switzerland, do they know about, the content of palm oil in the products they are buying, or the content of shea butter in the products they are buying? These are the questions that one could ask here, and how this influences, the sustainability outcomes. And then in terms of business services, many of the participants here are also offering business services to some form of agroforestry. And these business services, all these interact in ways in agricultural production. If you look at it in terms of value chain or supply chain, agricultural production, food storage, transport and trade, processing, retail and provisioning, and then food consumption. And at the end of the day, we all expect that we should have outcomes that are sustainable in terms of socioeconomic dimensions, and this can be in terms of livelihoods, living income for farmers. It can be in terms of reduction of poverty, or it can be in terms of right to food. But then it can also be in terms of the nutritional quality of what we are offering, from agroforestry products. And then it can be in terms of environmental outcomes. So this shows us that there are various, dimensions and various factors that are interacting. And the question is, if we want to change the system, it is not enough, to just focus on one factor. We need to focus on the interactions between the components of the system. That is why we need a systemic perspective on agroforestry. So based on that, I move on to talk about cocoa agroforestry. This is a bit what we are working on, but also a bit what we are going to work on in the next few years. So when we look at cocoa cropping systems, then we can differentiate between monocultures, where you just have cocoa trees, but you can also have complex cocoa agroforestry. So this picture, for example, is a cocoa agroforestry from Cameroon. And these are the different cocoa agroforestries. And then you have simple agroforestry systems. Maybe you have a few trees thrown around in the landscape. And then you have the complex systems like this one that has grown over time. And the question is, okay, how do you manage such systems? But going now from the environment to look at cocoa agroforestry across the world, then we see that most of the cocoa is being produced in South America and West Africa, with Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana being the major global producers. And of course, we can look at it from a land systems perspective to ask, okay, what about, where do they get the land to produce all this cocoa? We can also ask about it from the perspective, like I showed you, from the perspective of the actors. Who are the actors involved? But the message here is that, okay, we have these two major cocoa producing countries, and how are they managing cocoa production or cocoa bean production? And we are taking, for example, 2022 as an example. And if we look at the cocoa production and the market, and this diagram shows the production and the imports, and we can see that most of the production, like I said, is coming from West Africa and South America, and most of the importation is, so to say, in quotes, being done by the global north. Then if you look at this Sankey diagram, so CG is Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, rest of Africa, rest of West Africa, then North America, Latin America, Europe. So this is the production and then trade in cocoa beans. And what we can see here is that most of the production is done in these countries, which means it has ecological implications, it has social, economic implications, and then most of the processing and importation is being done in the global north, like you see on this side. So rest of the world, and then North America, and we see that Europe is a very big player in this dimension. But then the question is, okay, what does this all mean for the landscape in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire? And we can think of this, okay, if you're producing 43% or almost 44% of global cocoa beans, you need land to do so. So, and the question is, okay, what are the ecological contributions? Because we need to, the question again, why is cocoa agroforestry or agroforestry below potential? We can think of it, for example, in terms of shade cover trees, because the argument is that, okay, if you have a cocoa agroforestry, at least you could add shade cover of up to 30% area, so that at least it contributes to environmental functions. But then if we look at Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, then what we are seeing is that the areas that achieve this 30% threshold or recommendation is very low when you look at all the colors. So most of the colors are rather in the dark blue area. And then the cocoa monocultures, they also have less. And then if you look at cocoa agroforestry, they have, more or less up to 30%. But many of them don't have that. And then if we look at it in terms of also ecological contributions, in terms of above ground biomass density across the two countries, then we see that these two countries, here the legend, so here is up to about, yellow is up to 100 megagram per hectare. But then what we are seeing from this study is that most of the cocoa so-called agroforestry areas in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, they don't achieve this. And these are the reference areas. If you take a reference area, for example, Kakum National Park, here in number 3, so Kakum National Park has a high above ground biomass, but then this is also a national park in Cote d'Ivoire, but then the rest of the areas when you compare with the cocoa agroforestry, so there's still potential, to have more. Now, we move from the environment and then we look at, okay, what are the farmers doing? And this study also from Cameroon shows, okay, that there are strategies that farmers take, based on, and these strategies is not just based on their own experiences, but also based on the system within which they are in. So the study is telling us, for example, that in the last years, that due to demographic pressure, so you have increasing demographic pressure, and due to this increasing demographic pressure, that farmers are strategizing and innovating to adapt to the production environment that they have in. So for example, that you have family farmers, who, also including people that they characterize as native, that they have been living there for generations, and then you also have migrants. And in their farms, you have high tree species richness. So the first line, for example, that you have high tree species richness, and that you have but their cocoa production is more or less lower when you compare it to the others. So you just have this, it's lower. And then their use of chemical inputs is also lower. And their companion trees, like I showed you, mangoes or oranges and so on, their companion trees are more or less medium. But then the message here is that, okay, because of demographic pressure, and then farmers that are living near urban environments, for example, they have to adapt. So they have to adapt to the pressure on competition for land, converting agricultural land or cocoa land to houses. They have also to see how they can adapt to the economic environment in terms of also producing other crops beside cocoa, because sometimes the cocoa prices go down and there is no buffer or insurance capacity for the farmers. So they also have to look at that for themselves. So this, for example, and they have to find ways to intensify. So the study is telling us that those farms that are located near urban areas or where you have high population density, that are using a lot of intensification measures in terms also of inputs, so fungicides, and also in terms of diversification. But then you have a differentiation between farmers, smallholder farmers or family farmers, and those that are investing in cocoa as a business. And those that are investing in cocoa as a business, for example, they don't really have that tree species richness in their farms. And they're doing a lot of intensification. They're focusing really on cocoa production, employing people, and using a lot of chemicals, and then their companion trees is not that much. So they do the minimum to be able to capture that level. So another description that, or another discussion is we can look at in terms of plot tenure. Imagine those of you that are farmers here, imagine that you don't have the right to use the land that you're farming on. What kind of uncertainty will it give you? And this is the daily business of many farmers across Africa, and I think also across South America, for example, Peru, which I know for sure. So we have a cocoa plot tenure, and then some from inheritance, you have purchase, you have sharecropping, and then you can also rent. And then the type of workforce, this is very important because the workforce is family-based, so that means you cannot really employ somebody to come and say, okay, now I need to increase my production. You have to think about who in my family is able to do that. And then the origin of the farmer, looking at, okay, does it make a difference? And then also looking, for example, a cocoa agroforest area by farmer, and what we see, these are areas that have been newly opened up, so to say, compared to the traditional areas in the 1960s and so on. So these areas, you have more of people investing in land and having larger farms, for example. And then cocoa agroforest age, then of course the older ones, you see like that one that I showed you that looked like a forest, you find it most likely in the older agroforestry regions of Cameroon than you find it elsewhere. So now we move from Cameroon and we go to Côte d'Ivoire again to look at, okay, why are farmers then not, if we say, okay, that we have technologies, there are many things that farmers can do to improve their farming, so the question is, why are they then not adopting? And this study is telling us that, yeah, we need to understand farmers' practices and we also need to put it in context. So for example, that if you look at the area here, I just want to highlight this area. If you remember in the other map I showed you, this area is actually a national park. But it's a national park, and at the same time, you also have cocoa farms. So how do you go about that? So these are the uncertainties that people have if you're a migrant farmer and then you're farming on the fringes or within the officially demarcated areas of a national park, which is not really enforced. What does that mean with the security of your production? So then the question is then, why do farmers not adopt agroforestry? Of course, cocoa is a tree, but we don't say cocoa monoculture is agroforestry. You need to add other trees to it. So why are they not adopting? Or why are they adopting, first of all? Then so those that have trees on their farms that practice agroforestry, so 82% grew cocoa under companion trees, while 54% out of them had positive opinion about cocoa agroforestry, but 46% of the respondents, they had negative attitude or negative responses about cocoa agroforestry. And we can see that those that practice agroforestry, then they practice it because of food. I showed you before mango, you could also have some plantain in it, you could also have some palm in it, you could also have some fruit trees. other fruit trees that are used for medicinal purposes or that are used for cooking. So this is one of the major reasons that they add other trees to their farm. And then in terms of fertilization, and then in terms of shade tree, medicine, timber, and then they also use it as a fence to fence their farm, and then for firewood and other purposes. But then those that don't adopt, why do they reject agroforestry? They say no space. So this tells us that agroforestry is a competing land use with other land uses, because you need also to grow crops for food, and then you also need, if you're near an urban area, then that agroforestry plot is under pressure from urban development, from people that want to buy land for houses. And then you have people that say, okay, I already have enough trees, so I don't need to add more trees to my farm, or it's not important, and that it adversely affects the crops that they have or the cocoa that they have. And then issues of high humidity, because there are also diseases that affect cocoa, and these diseases, they tend to thrive under high humid conditions. So farmers, they also have to manage this, and then lack of knowledge and so on. So these are some of the factors. If we go further to look at other factors, then one aspect is also to think in terms of the social demographic. So social demographic could be in terms of gender, whether you're a man, a male farmer, or a woman farmer. So we see here, for example, that male farmers are more likely, to adopt agroforestry compared to female farmers. We also see that if you're, the cash crops, to adding cash crops, then you're also more likely also to add if you have cash crops, then you're also more likely to add agroforestry or add other trees. And then if you have black pod, so if you have the black pod disease, then you're less likely, to add more companion trees to your farm. And then also the duration of residency, which did not show. So these are different factors that one can look at. Of course, if I'm doing analysis and I'm sitting on my computer and doing a remote sensing analysis, I don't need to ask this kind of questions. But if I want to change the whole system, then I need to understand how the various dimensions are functioning. So then we move on to other dimensions. I talked about tenure issues. So tenure, power, inclusion, we can also think about that when we are talking about agroforestry. I did not attend all the sessions, so perhaps there were some sessions that talked about power or tenure issues. So when we look at agroforestry across, let's say, across sub-Saharan Africa, we have institutional pluralism. So on the one hand, you have customary land tenure systems, and then on the other hand, you have statutory tenure. And this is a legacy of the colonial period. So what does that mean? That means that customarily, you use land, you own land by using it. So if I own land by using it, then I have to ensure that I'm continuously using that land, or I'm continuously showing people that I'm using that land so that they don't take the land away from me. But then under statutory law, then I have to have a land certificate. And these two systems are existing till today in various African countries, to some extent less, to some extent more, but also in the major cocoa producing areas of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire is existing. And the question is, how do people or how do farmers strategize? And this farmer, I leave you to read this. So this is also, imagine that the farmer, even though he has maybe a land certificate, and then he's thinking, okay, if I plant a tree, that is a risk, because the person that is more powerful than me in the community can think, okay, now that land has gained in value, now I reallocate that land to somebody else, and I reallocate another land to the farmer. So the investments of that farmer is gone. So we have issues of land and tree tenure. They can also be different. One person owning the land, another person owning a tree tenure. They can limit agroforestry adoption. Issues of gender inequalities, that women, oftentimes they don't have access or they don't have land ownership, and when they have access to the land, then their access to the land is dependent on what the man or the husband or the uncle or the father decides to do. And this is still an issue that is kind of like limiting the potentials of women in agroforestry. And then you have a compliance burden on insecure land tenure, and this compliance burden can be, let's think in terms of EUDR, for example. I think most of you know about EUDR, or due diligence purposes, and you have to tell a farmer, okay, you have to bring a certificate to show me that you own the land before you can participate in, let's say, direct payment scheme or something. And what happens to that farmer if she or he does not have the certificate? So this is also a limiting factor. And then we have poorly regulated large-scale land acquisitions. In many African countries, studies are showing investors are buying up land either for carbon farming, so to say, or for agroforestry. But then at the end of the day, the way land is not, there is no free land, so to say. There's land, most land across the world is underused, either temporarily or permanently. And then if that land goes into the hand of large investors, which is per se not bad, but then what do you do with those societal actors or those farmers that have been using that land since many years? And then there is no regulation to address such issues. So we have policy and governance challenges. So we have weak and misaligned policies. So this can be in terms of that you have policy incoherence in many countries, not only across Africa, but also in Peru, for example, that the Ministry of Environment is not talking with the Ministry of Agriculture, and the Ministry of Agriculture is not talking, with other ministries of forestry where you have them separated. And then at the end of the day, it is the National Spatial Planning or the National Finance Office that decides what happens with all resources of the country. So how are we supposed to, achieve that potential when we have such disconnections? And then the improved cocoa varieties that are mainly adapted to full sun conditions. So when we are talking about, okay, a farmer should adopt agroforestry, if the varieties are not there that can support them to address humidity issues and so on, then how do we expect such an actor, to adopt, to put trees besides the cocoa trees that she or he has on the farm? And we have a neglect of traditional agroforestry systems because the public incentive frameworks, especially many national agricultural policies that are looking at production. How can we increase our production of cocoa so that we increase our earnings, export earnings, for example, of hard currency? So this favors also intensive production, monocultures, and not agroforestry or agroecology like we would like to have it. And then there are asymmetric trade and trade conditions and demands. I mentioned EUDR already before, but there are also other schemes that are there. So you have deforestation-free and traceability rules that are enforced globally, but then without, checking how does this affect the mostly smallholder farmers that are in these agroforestry systems. And then, of course, sometimes in some countries, they offer support. For example, in Peru, the EU is offering support to support the smallholder farmers to transition towards EUDR. But then these inadequate measures, there are also inadequate measures to address market uncertainties. About, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, we had price spikes in the cocoa market. So what did the farmers do in the areas where we worked in West Africa? They cleared the forest. They put new cocoa farms in there. And when we asked them, they said, yeah, but the price has increased and so on. And then we said, but now the price is down again. But the forest is gone. So in that sense, this is something that an individual person cannot address. So that's why we need a systemic perspective. But then the policy strategies that have been taken so far Only 70, this study tells us that only 7% of the policy instrument, they pursue system-level changes, so regime-level changes. So this diagram just shows us the different types of instruments that were shown in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. And these different types of instruments, so the lighter the color, the more disruptive the policy instrument is. But then if you look at the disruptive policies that they found in Côte d'Ivoire and in Ghana, they are really little compared to the normal policies that are out there. And then the idea is that such policies should be able to change the system. But then, for example, establishing market niches does not change the system, according to this study. And other studies have also shown that these policies are fragmented. So you have incoherent and fragmented policies, incoherent and fragmented actor networks. So there is need for more coordination in the system if we need to have a system change. So I bring another study that is also looking at these challenges, and these challenges in cocoa agroforestry system. This is more coming from actors in the, or social actors in the sector that are looking at, okay, what are the challenges? And the challenges can be summarized under human rights challenges, environmental protection, living income, and then there are many other factors that are contributing to it. So these many other factors, sometimes we read in the newspapers about child labor, lack of education, labor rights of farmers, and then in terms of environmental protection, we have it all there, deforestation and so on. But then a major issue is the living income, because most of the farmers in those countries, especially in this study that they were looking at Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, most of those farmers that are earning or living below living income. So you work throughout the year and then you remain poor, and then we are still telling the farmers you have to intensify, you have to do this and that. So in that sense, they attribute this to distant decisions that do not understand the context of the farmers. They also attribute this to decisions made by the powerful, in the sense that those that have power, they do not adequately consider the perspective of those that do not have power to change policies or to change market dynamics. And most of the times, okay, there have been calls, yeah, we need higher prices, but these higher prices have not been addressed. All the strategies that most of the companies and governments have taken did not increase living income. So the focus there, according to this study, is that the focus is still on what the farmer has to do. You know, you have to increase your market share, you have to go to training, you have to self-organize, without looking at the system-level issues that can change the conditions for the farmers. So they argue for more transparency and accountability, more holistic landscape approaches, bottom-up approaches, and also that we have mandatory regulations. So if we look at the living income example that they brought, so if you look at cocoa farmers in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, they produce below living income. And other studies have also shown that living income is something that farmers cannot achieve based on the current conditions that we have. And in that sense, the factors that have been brought in terms of contributing to this aspect of farmers not being able to achieve living income is in terms of unaffordable labor, because most of the farmers are depending on family labor. And to fill in the living income gap, the countries, so Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, they arranged with some cocoa companies that they should try to pay living income. And this was some years ago, but they still have not achieved it. So this diagram is telling us that, okay, these are the labor days. If we want farmers to achieve 800 kilo per hectare, so then farmers have to increase their labor days up till 150 labor days or 200 labor days to reach 1,000 kilo per hectare. But still, what is important here is that they still, even if you achieve all this, you still don't achieve living income. So there is need to increase the price, you know, the price of the cocoa bean, to increase the price. So currently the price, at that time, the price was 1,500, and then here is 2,200, and then here 3. And if you were to increase this price, then you add 20% to the living income. And then these are minus levels of the living income. So the message here is if you tell farmers to increase productivity, that does not help. We have to set the prices. So setting the prices, perhaps somebody from economics will say, yeah, you cannot set the prices because you're interfering with the markets. But there have been other countries that have done it through maybe direct payments, to compensate the farmers for what they are contributing, for example, to environmental protection, without necessarily interfering with the markets. But the message here is that if you tell farmers to increase productivity, they will still not achieve that living income that they need to improve their situation, so they will most likely remain poor. So in these socioeconomic and market barriers, there are also other issues. So if a farmer is poor, then how do you expect the farmer to invest in cocoa production? For example, to buy the pesticides, all the other things that are needed. So this study shows that across Africa that smallholder agroforestry systems, they require investments of up to $1,000 per hectare. But then if you need to increase or intensify, then you will need to add more money. But these are farmers that are having income or that are poor. And then you have a delayed return on investment. Like all of us know, by the time you start your agroforestry and by the time you get the money, it's also getting less. So by the time you reach profitability, years have passed. So in that sense, the question is, what can be done, besides only just focusing on the farmers and telling them you have to do ABC? So one aspect is that you have governance challenges, because even the cocoa that is being bought and the arrangements that are being made between business sector and the government, you still cannot trace most of the cocoa that the companies are using. So for example, here they said traceable to cooperatives. You can trace 46 or 44% of the cocoa beans that are being used. You can trace them to the cooperatives. But remember, most or many farmers are not organized in cooperatives. So where do their cocoa beans go to, if you're talking about traceability? So in that sense, you have 32% that is unknown, and then you have indirect in the sense that maybe they go to the cooperative and then give it to the cooperative, and then you get to this. So the message here is that about 56% of the cocoa beans that are being traded as at that time in 2022 is unaccounted. You cannot trace them. So we see the potential here also for the system. So in that sense, we need transformative change, based on all these challenges that we are seeing. So the challenge is not only in the environmental dimension, but also in the socio-economic dimension and governance dimension. And I bring you the definition of the EBES, which focuses on transformative change as a system-wide change. So it's fundamental, it's system-wide, and it's about changing views and changing structures. So we understand structures as institutions, and it's about changing practices, and these are interconnected. And it's about addressing underlying causes. So the underlying causes, I've shown you many of the underlying causes, and these underlying causes can also be seen in this diagram that I bring again to show that when we are talking about all these factors that I'm talking about, you can place them here, but this will clutter this diagram. We can place them in this dimension, and these various dimensions, they interact to positively or adversely influence one another. And then we also have the underlying environment. In this sense, I'm understanding sustainability as the strong sustainability that we have to live within the planetary boundaries. So it's not about governance, but we have to first of all see that we can maintain ecological functioning. So in that sense, these dimensions, depending on what you change here, it affects actors, it affects agroforestry practices, it affects agroforestry system activities when we think of it in terms of a food system or in terms of a commodity system. Then that can then lead to these outcomes. So I just bring some examples to quickly go through. So if we look in terms of politics, we can improve regulation. So these are underlying, we said transformative change is about underlying factors. So if we change something here, we cannot expect to change the system. Of course, there are feedbacks that could also trigger something in the system. So here, if we change regulatory measures, for example, to say, okay, that we have coherent international and national policies, because it's not just, also there is also incoherence between international policies and national policies. When we agree something on the Paris Agreement, how is this being translated at the local levels without causing conflict and hardship for the people at the local level? So in that sense, this can make changes. If we change regulatory measures, this can change, bring about changes here, which can then affect the outcomes that we expect or improve the system. So in that sense, we can promote an enabling environment for sustainable cocoa, so legislation in consuming countries, but also legislation in importing countries. And this has been done with the EUDR, for example. There were also other legislation before the EUDR, for example. And then we can also think in terms of cooperatives. So, but how do we bring the farmers that are not members of the cooperative, how do we bring them to become members of the cooperative so that, we can improve accountability and we can also improve human rights issues? So in that sense, that is a question for the system and not a question for one single farmer. And then also a need for a strong autonomous farmer, but a strong autonomous farmer has to be informed, has to be educated, has to know how to use internet, has to know how to fill all the forms that we are sending them from the ministries. For example, let me just take example from Switzerland. Farmers complain, or some farmers, not all of them, complain about all the forms they have to fill to get the direct payments. Now, let's shift the perspective to a farmer somewhere else in a developing country context that does not have all the resources that a farmer in Switzerland has. How do we make farmers, or how do we empower them so they're autonomous and they can use all the instruments that we are providing for them? Then it's also about deliberative inclusion, that one thinks in terms of collaboration. How can collaboration across sectors, across levels, national and local levels, be achieved? In some places, it works. I mean, if I look at Switzerland, I would say it works in Switzerland because I know many places where they have not achieved what has been achieved in the context of collaboration or collaborative arrangements in Switzerland. But somebody knowing only Switzerland will probably say, okay, there are some issues that still need to be improved. And then it's about transparency and accountability. So if we look at all these and then just take it to go to Peru, for example, to see, okay, how is EUDR, how are people responding to EUDR as a regulatory measure? Then we see that there are challenges. I think many of you know these challenges, so I don't have to go through them, but maybe I focus on the transformative potentials of this. So EUDR has triggered action in the system in the sense that there is now multi-stakeholder governance and national action plans that are, people are talking with themselves, with each other. How can we improve the situation so that we can address the challenges that EUDR has brought for us so that we can also maintain our markets in Europe? It has also increased dialogue between actors across Peru's cocoa and coffee sectors, so they talk to one another more than before. And it has increased incentives for smallholders and the likelihood of formalization of land. Because in Peru, we also have land tenure issues, especially for those farmers that are in the frontier, in areas where they don't have legal documents about the farms where they have the cocoa plots. So because of that, then there are discussions now about how to address such issues, because if not, those farmers will be left out or they can go into illegal activities, because many of the farmers were also those that were encouraged to get out of cocoa production into cocoa production. So then in terms also of collaborative governance, we can look to Switzerland and see that there are also actions going on in Switzerland. For example, we have the Swiss coffee platform. the Swiss Sustainable Coffee Platform. I'm sure there are some members here, and then the Swiss Platform for Sustainable Cocoa, where the people from industry, research, NGO sector have come together to see how to improve sustainability in the sector. And the idea, of course, is then to achieve better outcomes than we have them now. Then if we go to the area of economy, there are also things that you can do in the economy. So you can do financial incentives for the farmers. You can improve on-farm processing. But on-farm processing, you also need to be embedded in the socio-economic environment, because you do on-farm processing and then you cannot export to Europe because you have higher tariffs for processed products compared to when you just export the unprocessed beans. And think of in terms of tax incentives or voluntary carbon markets or payment for ecosystem services. All these are existing in some places, but as niches. But this can be brought together systematically to improve the outcomes. Then we can also think of enabling technological innovations. So it could be open access traceability. We are talking about traceability now, but then the issue is who owns the data afterwards. So if you say, okay, you are going to do geolocation of a farm, and then the farmer gives you all the information, so who owns that information? So through an open access approach, this could be addressed, for example, or you could also do inter and transdisciplinary research. We were talking yesterday, I think it was yesterday, that we were talking about the various dimensions, whether now we are looking at it from a conservation perspective, or if we are looking at it from market perspective or land use perspective. And then in that sense, so technology is important, and this is a place where research can come in, and then collaboration is also needed in research and not just single disciplinary perspectives. So in that sense, if we look at, it's not just about these dimensions that I'm talking about, we can also think in terms of culture and social demographics. So creating communities of practice, we do that as researchers. Farmers also do that. So in that sense, how can we promote communities of practice to achieve system-wide transformations? And now this brings me to a dimension where we can say, okay, now how do we do all this? I've shown different dimensions. How do we do this? So don't be alarmed. I'm not going to go into this diagram. It's just to show you that we could do through system dynamics and system modeling. We can achieve the dimensions. We can achieve more insight into the interactions between system components. So this is shows you our work on forest. And the idea here is that there are different dimensions. There are reinforcing loops, there are stabilizing loops, but one of the reinforcing loops is that it drives self-reinforcing cycle of losing 13.2 hectares of forest per year if we continue as business as usual. This is based on a study in West Africa that one of our colleagues did. So you have a declining trend. And based on that, then you can do different simulations. We also saw simulations yesterday. You can do different simulations. And these different simulations show, for example, that if you follow only, here we see the red is the business as usual. And then if you promote plural values, then you could get a 58% reduction in deforestation. So that means that you gain 25 hectares. If you promote, for example, alternative livelihoods, then you reduce pressure on the forest. This is also thinking about that agroforestry is also a driver of deforestation, by the way. And then if we think in terms of, for example, that we say community reforestation, so we activate, work with the communities to do reforestation, then we can increase forest gain, and then if also improve monitoring and enforcement. You see, there are different strategies that one can take. You can also improve forest area. But the message here is that one strategy is not enough. We need different strategies. And these different strategies, we see them here. So for example, the different strategies, plural values, monitoring and enforcement, alternative livelihoods, and business as usual. And what we see that we can only achieve when we take all the strategies together as an integrative approach, then we can only achieve, an upward direction by between 2030 and 2035. And these are the different factors, as we see here, that interact, to be able to achieve the net decrease or net increase in forest areas. So with that, I would like to conclude, for example, by drawing on the different strands that I talked to you about. So agroforestry is a social ecological system, but it is context specific. We have cross-scale interactions, and then we have multiple barriers to agroforestry, like we saw. It's about perceptions, experiences, but it's also about the underlying factors. And then we have a need for a plural valuation, and also looking at the trade-offs, because when different factors are interacting, then there are trade-offs. And the governance support for agroforestry has not achieved its potential, so we really have to look at the governance, because it's about these underlying factors. So transformative potential needs policy mixes, so it's not just one strategy, but many. And one of those strategies that might bring about transformation or trigger transformation in different ways is the EUDR, but it has various challenges. And then we can also relate it to theories about or concepts of telecoupling and polycentric governance. And at the end, we need integrative approaches. So with that, I thank you for your attention. Thank you for having me. And I thank also members of my group. And then in case you're interested in the references, I use these as the references. And yeah, thanks.